Unless you skipped a lot of history classes, most of you know about the Third Reich and its devastation. Today we're going to look at a different 20th century Reich that also caused a lot of damage. It's just not as obvious. And if you've got little ones within earshot today, you should probably know that we're going to be dealing with some, pretty grown-up concepts. So maybe get those little ones out of earshot. You know, it's a little disingenuous when I tell people that I'm a child of the 60s because in reality, I barely qualify. I entered this world in October of 1969, so my memory of the 60s only amounts to whatever it is that a newborn can remember, which of course isn't much. Although I will say this, we know the human brain really does appear to remember absolutely everything it's exposed to. So somewhere in there, I must have some kind of newborn impressions of the last months of the 60s, somewhere written in my memory banks. In fact, I've actually had this sneaking suspicion for a long time, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but I've had this suspicion that some of those alien abduction stories that you hear on late night radio or on that channel they used to be, the History Channel, what if some of those stories are actually memories of your birth? I mean, if you think about it, most of them seem to include some remarkably similar details, like suddenly being taken into a cold, brightly lit room where strange-looking creatures begin to poke and prod you, and you're completely helpless while it's happening. So what if, just maybe, some of those so-called abductions are actually just fuzzy old memories of the doctors and nurses who poked and prodded you in the delivery room? Now, I don't have any research to back that up. It's just kind of a hunch. But I do think I've heard a psychiatrist suggest the possibility. But it is just a hunch. And now I'm wandering off topic. So maybe we should come back someday to the subject of flying saucers, because I think there are some very interesting philosophical and spiritual questions that go along with those stories. But for today, I want to get back to the 60s and the 70s because, as you know, it was a really tumultuous time in the Western world and here in the United States in particular. A lot of longtime social conventions were being completely upended, with people questioning institutional authority and challenging American participation in Vietnam. It was the era of the flower children, the hippies, who were preaching a different approach to life than the Western world was typically used to. Make love, not war, they said, and they preached it with long hair and bare feet and with peace symbols showing up just about everywhere. These people were the ultimate nonconformists, the ones who exercised their libertine lifestyles by practicing sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was the era of Timothy Leary, the psychology professor from Harvard, who began to promote the recreational use of psychedelic drugs, things like LSD, this strange new substance that had been accidentally discovered in fairly recent history. And Leary suggested that maybe these drugs were some kind of shortcut to higher levels of enlightenment. Think for yourself and question authority, he taught, which on its own is not that bad of an idea because obviously not all authority is good or even trustworthy. So yeah, I can appreciate the concept. But Mr. Leary was also famous for that phrase, turn on, tune in, and drop out, which I would argue was not as good an idea as questioning authority because it led to a great deal of anarchy. And a lot of people used his philosophy as an excuse to do a lot of drugs. Some of you might remember that President Nixon actually called Leary the most dangerous man in America. The 60s and 70s were this radical turning point here in the West because experimental ideas that had been pretty much restricted to the ivory towers of academia suddenly went mainstream, and we saw traditional Western values being dismantled at a rather disturbing pace. And it's not that we shouldn't be questioning tradition, because I do think we should. But at the same time, I think it's really, really important to understand why social norms were invented in the first place before we start to mindlessly rip them down. It's a little like renovating your house and knocking down the walls without ever checking to see if some of them might be load-bearing. Knock down the wrong wall, you lose the structure. Knock down the wrong social convention, and the same thing can happen. Now, one of the places we started to do this was in the area of human sexuality. The 60s were the era of free love, and once the pill was invented, people started to think there was no reason to cling to so-called outdated ideas like marriage or monogamy. Those were considered outdated, and as you know, people began to experiment. And today, I'm convinced we're living with the aftermath of those experiments. Now, before I go any further, I should probably underline just a couple of ideas. Number one, I'm going to speak quite frankly about this subject. So if you have kids who are listening right now, you might want to find something else for them to do for the next little while, or just go to VOP.com and watch this show later, maybe after the kids go to bed. Number two, because of some of the unfortunate stereotypes associated with American preachers, I should probably state right up front, I am not in favor of Western Christians using the power of the state to regulate the religious morality of their neighbors. I mean, yes, there's no doubt, I am a Christian, and I firmly believe there is a right and a wrong way for people to express sexuality. But at the same time, I don't believe for 1 minute that the church should be in charge of regulating the way you choose to live your life, because frankly, these matters are between you and God. Now, with those disclaimers out of the way, I think I want to focus on the actual origin of some of the ideas that prompted the sexual revolution. And if I was going to pick just one place to start, just one great thinker who really had an impact, I'd probably have to go with Sigmund Freud, who is still remembered as having a rather strident obsession with the subject of human reproduction. Freud was a huge believer in the idea that a lot of what we do as human beings is motivated by the pursuit of pleasure. He said we try to avoid or mitigate the painful parts of life, a tiny little bit like the ancient Epicureans. And he said we should try to embrace the things that give us pleasure. In the theory of psychoanalysis he wrote back in 1920, we have no hesitation in assuming that the course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. We believe, that is to say, that the course of those events is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension, and that it takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure. All right, I'll give him that. So far, so good, because it kind of makes sense. Most of us really do want to avoid pain and experience pleasure. It's just our human nature. But the way that Freud understood this concept led to some real problems in a world that was pretty much dominated by Judeo-Christian thought. In other words, biblical thought. Freud suggested that we should embrace all the impulses that move toward pleasure, including sexual pleasure. And if you try to restrict that, he said, if you try to suppress your natural urges, it'll mess you up in the head. He taught that the suppression of your sexual instincts will somehow lead to neurotic behavior and you would become mentally and emotionally unhealthy. Then he said, that's going to make you act irrationally. And that would be society's fault because they shouldn't be telling you what's right or wrong. Repressing your urges, he said, leads to irrational behavior and unnecessary anxiety. And honestly, that's kind of ironic because the least inhibited generation to ever occupy this continent now seems to be one of the most anxious. But let's get back to the 1960s, where you find the flower children taking these concepts very seriously. We suddenly get people preaching that concepts like monogamy or marriage are repressive and harmful. They supposedly keep us from self-actualization or personal fulfillment. These people believed that the free love movement couldn't possibly harm anybody. They said it was an evolutionary step forward. Now, to be honest, there really were some unhealthy ideas about sexuality that emerged from the Victorian period, when the subject was usually treated as if it's shameful and dirty, which is not the Bible's perspective. So yeah, there were some things that probably needed fixing, but the idea that controlling your animal instincts will lead to mental illness? That's a concept I really want to challenge. But right now it's time for a break, so don't you go anywhere because I'll be right back after this short message to look at the ideas that came from one of Freud's biggest disciples, another psychologist by the name of Wilhelm Reich.
Here Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Wilhelm Reich, the Austrian doctor, was easily one of the more radical psychiatrists who emerged in the wake of Sigmund Freud. And he went places with Dr. Freud's work that really put a dent on the traditional moral values of the West. In fact, I believe that in a lot of ways, Wilhelm Reich is a key architect, if not the architect, of the sexual revolution. Like Dr. Freud, he taught that repressing your natural drive is a bad idea. He actually said it would lead to mental illness. The moral inhibitions of society, he said, are actually making people sick. I mean, just listen to what he wrote back in the 1930s. He said, under the condition of neurotic sexual repression, every patient carries within himself the insoluble contradiction between instinctual drive and moralistic compulsion. The moral demands that, under the constant pressure of social influence he places on himself, intensify the blocking of his sexual and general vegetative needs. So, in other words, back in the 1930s, Wilhelm Reich was teaching that the moral values of society, the restrictions and boundaries that your culture places on sexual expression, he said those are in direct conflict with your natural passion. And that's what he said leads to all the moral problems. If only people were allowed to act out their urges freely, he said, if only we provided a way for everybody to indulge his or her appetite, then horrible things like sexual assault would just go away. I know it seems laughable today, but why did he say that? It's because he believed that sexual crimes are just the result of people acting out against the unreasonable restrictions imposed by society. Indulging your appetite, he taught, was perfectly healthy. And before you're tempted to agree with him, you should probably know that Mr. Reich also meant kids. You heard me right. Now, Dr. Reich built his theory by studying some of his own patients, which makes me think he was probably building his philosophy on a very shaky foundation. The people he was treating, after all, already had problems with mental health or with normal sexual expression, which makes me question the idea that the urges of his patients should be used as a baseline for an authentic human sexual expression. He was taking symptoms of an illness and using those to establish what he thought should be the picture of health. Of course, the drive to reproduce really is a natural instinct, and so is the desire for physical relationships. But in Dr. Reich's secular worldview, he believed that all instincts, all drives, all feelings are perfectly natural, and he said we experience them for a good reason. But from the Bible's perspective, in the Judeo-Christian understanding of our human nature, we believe that our feelings need to be informed by the fact that our natural instincts have been corrupted. According to the Bible, not every impulse you have is a good one. So, to suggest that we should just indulge every passion when we feel it, well, that idea becomes very problematic, at least from a biblical worldview. For that matter, so do Mr. Reich's feelings about marriage, because he believed that marriage and monogamy were unnatural. In fact, he pretty much argued that they are utterly outdated. Listen to what he said. If no suitable partner is available, as seems to be the rule under the prevailing conditions of sexual life, the tendency toward monogamy turns into its opposite, namely, into the uncontrollable search for the right partner. If that partner is found, the monogamous behavior is spontaneously restored and is maintained as long as sexual harmony and gratification last. Fantasies and wishes for other partners are either very weak or else ignored because of the interest in the current partner. However, the relationship collapses irretrievably if it becomes stale and if another companion promises greater pleasure. So, here's what he's saying. Cheating on your spouse is natural, he said, and we should expect it because nobody should ever control their sexual urges. Reich believed that marriage is artificial, an institution the church imposed on the world, and he said that getting married makes you repressed and unhealthy, which is exactly the attitude that emerged during the sexual revolution. We even question the need for the nuclear family, and of course a lot of people are still doing that. Marriage was seen as an unnecessary prison for both men and women. For men, they said it was keeping them from pursuing their natural urges. And for women, they said it was a prison designed to maintain the patriarchy. And today, I believe we're living with the fallout of that kind of thinking. We now have a generation that was raised on this libertine morality, and honestly, I don't believe for a minute that it's a coincidence that this same generation now struggles with terrible feelings of meaninglessness, alienation, and loneliness. And yes, I'll admit, a lot of male attitudes about women have been wrong, and there are a lot of marriages that do become prisons for the people who have to live in them. But what I can't agree with is the way that some people point to the Bible or Christianity as the problem. When marriages fall apart, or when so-called Christian spouses cheat on each other, or when husbands and wives treat each other badly, it's not because of the teachings of Christ, it's in spite of them. In fact, you might remember, there was an occasion when the religious authorities of the day, the Pharisees, approached Jesus and asked him a rather tricky question about divorce. And I guess the reason I'm thinking about this is because so many people are rightly alarmed at the high divorce rate, even among Christians. And much in the spirit of Dr. Reich, some people are blaming the institution of marriage itself. Now, there's no question that the Scriptures underline the importance and sanctity of marriage, but in a broken world, sometimes God's ideal gets compromised by us. So the Pharisees, knowing that divorce is undesirable, approached Jesus with a question, and you find it in Matthew 19. It says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?' And he answered and said to them, 'Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate.'" All right? So far, so good. In fact, those words are still being used by Christian ministers to this day every time they perform a wedding. What God has joined together, let nobody separate. In fact, it's a formula I still use when I pronounce a couple to be husband and wife. When Jesus' critics bring up the subject of divorce, he answers by underlining the original design. From God's perspective, marriage was meant to last for life. But then, trying to trip Jesus up, the Pharisees pointed out that the law of Moses actually allowed for divorce. Here's what it says in verse 7. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." In other words, the Bible is a very realistic document. That's one of the reasons I prize this book so highly. This book reveals God's original design, His plan for humanity, and then it openly deals with the fact that you and I don't live up to that, not since the fall. Yes, marriage was meant to last for life, but given the ungodly way that you and I behave, it can unsurprisingly fall apart. So what we have in the Bible is a very realistic God. Christians are required to make it work, but then sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't. Now, here's the thing I really want you to notice. In the first part of last century, Wilhelm Reich was teaching people that marriage, monogamy, and sexual boundaries were standing in the way of an authentic human sexuality. But that was a radical departure from the advice found in this book. So then, of course, we need to ask, who was right? Wilhelm Reich or the creator of the human race? I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
The sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s saw people throw away a lot of long-standing moral boundaries, some of which have been serving us really well. And that was fueled by this strange idea that controlling your urges is going to make you something less than human. They said it might even promote mental illness. Now, that was a complete turnabout from the way that Western philosophy thought about this subject for thousands of years. I mean, it used to be a point of pride that you could control your baser instincts and submit them to logic. But in the middle of the 20th century, we kind of turned that thinking on its head, and it led to some advice that's still being doled out by some well-meaning psychologists to this day. Many years ago, I met this guy who told me he was struggling with an addiction to pornography. So he went to a counselor who told him that his marriage was obviously not meeting his needs, and what he needed to do was go out and cheat on his wife. I mean, imagine that. That is horrible advice. But that's exactly what Mr. Reich was teaching. And while it makes for a tantalizing soap opera, it is not made for a better society. Dr. Reich suggested that if we only provided outlets for everybody's urges, if we removed the silly moral boundaries, then people could be free to pursue whatever they want. And because their needs were now being met, he said they would voluntarily refrain from terrible crimes. Just indulge your urges, and you will become a well-adjusted person. You can practice morality from a completely rational perspective. But my goodness, what a mess. He completely underestimated the power of a misguided human urge. He built his theory on the idea that all of our urges are good, and in the process he ignored something that most of us have known for a really long time. There is something flawed in our human nature that continues to produce a lot of suffering in this world. Not every instinct we have is good, not even close. For countless generations, we've been struggling with the realization that we harbor good and evil in our hearts, the way the Bible describes. This idea that just indulging your appetite is going to satiate it and stop your craving, it's preposterous. I mean, just think about our destructive tendencies toward addiction. It turns out that it's not just drugs or alcohol that create a counterfeit sense of well-being. Inappropriate sexual activity can do the same thing in the very short run. But in the end, I promise, it's going to destroy you. I'm reminded of a passage from the book of Proverbs that describes things that are never satisfied. This is Proverbs 30, verse 15. It says, "The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. There are 3 things that are never satisfied. 4 never say enough. The grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not satisfied with water, and the fire never says enough." What it's describing is a bottomless appetite. A fire will burn as long as you feed it, and the more you feed it, the hotter it gets. Likewise, you can backfill a grave after somebody dies, but that's not the end of death by a long stretch. You and I will go on digging graves until we need one ourselves. And the same thing holds true for fallen passion. The drive for sex was entirely natural in the beginning, until you and I became sinful and selfish. Fallen humanity tends to think of other people as a means to an end, a way to gratify our personal desires. We think of other people as a path to self-fulfillment. Even one of the best-known lines from the most popular rom-coms underlines it. You complete me. Our fallen nature means that almost everything is now centered on self, including sexual drive. God's original design has been corrupted by us, and as it turns out, a corrupt sexual appetite can never be appeased. The more fuel you put on that fire, the hotter it burns. And the sexual drive is a very hot fire that demands your attention. That's why the Apostle Paul acknowledged it and provided a legitimate solution to the church in Corinth, a city that was known for promiscuity. But if they cannot exercise self-control, he wrote, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Why is marriage a better solution than promiscuity? Because it involves commitment. It's not really about self. If we do this the way that God designed, it respects and honors the other person, and it refuses to use that individual for your gratification. All right, I've got to take one last break. So now's a great time to go and get a snack or check your mailbox, and I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Years ago, I found myself volunteering at a men's prison, where I visited about once a month and made myself available to just listen to the inmates. The institution housed a lot of serious criminals, most of whom were there for either first-degree murder or sexual assault, which meant they had a lot of sexual offenders. And this might come as a surprise to you, and I think we can thank the likes of Wilhelm Reich, but they were piping dirty movies into the prison rec room so the prisoners could watch them. And the thinking seemed to go like this: give the men a so-called outlet, and it will keep their criminal tendencies under control. Then on top of that, unbelievably, they appointed a female chaplain who had to spend a lot of time alone with these guys. And I'm sure you can guess what happened next. It was only a matter of time until that poor chaplain got assaulted. As it turns out, feeding a twisted instinct is the wrong idea, because some of our instincts are just plain wrong. The original design for human sexuality has been corrupted to the point where I believe it has become one of the biggest sources of pain in this world, and it's not getting any better. If Mr. Reich was correct, then abandoning moral boundaries should have made us happier and healthier. But let me ask you this: has that proven to be even remotely true? The nightmare of sexual assault continues to this day. Infidelity continues to rip at the fabric of families, which takes an unbelievable toll on children. Wilhelm Reich believed that liberalization would lead to fewer problems, but it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. Look, again, just to be perfectly clear, I am not suggesting that the morals of the church should be the law of the land, because I am not in favor of coerced morality or mandatory religion. I think the medieval church, with its torture chambers and its public executions, proved beyond all reasonable doubt that the marriage of church and state was a horrible idea. I'm not in favor of it. But at the same time, I'm asking you to consider the claims of this book, because they're not at all what some people have told you. This is not some kind of manual for repression or oppression, and it's certainly not a book for prudes. This is a book that presents a very healthy, very rewarding picture of human sexuality, and it's one that will help you avoid an awful lot of unnecessary pain. Marriage and sexuality, after all, were God's idea, a gift to the human race. And I would like to suggest that maybe God knows what He's talking about. What God has joined together, we should never try to separate. And maybe, just maybe, you and I are more than animals made in the image of God. That's all the time I've got for this week. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic. Hey, thanks for watching Authentic. Would you be willing to do me a favor? Like, subscribe, and drop a comment. That really does help the algorithm put Authentic in front of more people. And it's free. So go ahead, like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you.